In this video, I want to talk about the challenges of being alone. And specifically, I want to talk about the challenges associated with being alone in the way you think, in the way you see things, in the way you problem solve, in the way you approach the complexities of the world around you. One of the things that inspired me to start this channel was that I had conversation after conversation with people who are typically like people working in like relatively professional contexts, or like, I guess, are senior in their field, whether they were working in medicine, whether they were entrepreneurs, whether they were lawyers, people that worked in a bunch of different disciplines. But after I would speak with them, and usually it was something like, we met by happenstance at like a party or like some kind of networking event, or we just happened to sit next to each other on a plane. What would typically happen, the way the conversation would go, is we would talk about something, usually involving, the complexity of whatever challenge that they were dealing with. And then at the end of the conversation, they would say something along the lines like, really great talking to you about this. Like, I don't have anybody that I can talk to about this kind of thing that sort of like is on the same wavelength as me. And the first few times I heard that, I sort of brushed it off and was just like, these are people trying to flatter me and, say that they enjoyed the conversation, which I appreciated. But then it kept happening, and I realized that, there might be a type of person that I could help here. And there might be a type of person that I could serve with whatever work it is that I do next. Most of the time when these conversations were happening, I was busy doing something else. And in the last few years, if you've watched my earlier videos, you know that I really pulled away from the busyness that I was consumed with and went through kind of my own process of sort of reorienting to the world and exploring my questions of purpose and what I wanted to be doing. And now that I'm publishing again, now that I have a bit of a plan in mind, this is the kind of person that I'm interested in helping and supporting. So if that's you, then you're in the right place. The other thing I should say is a lot of these people were people that worked in government, because I spent a lot of time working in political advocacy organizations and thinking about democratic renewal. So it was often somebody who was sort of like frustrated with the silos of bureaucracy and was just trying to think of ways to make the public service better, or the part of the public service that they were in better. So in this video, we're going to talk about the challenges of working alone, the challenges of being alone, not necessarily physically alone, but alone in mindset, alone in, I'll use the word worldview to describe that, what I'm talking about. And I'll talk about my own experience first, because initially when I began working as, working in the world of advocacy politics, and it would have been back in 2008. So I'm not going to count it. It's 2024. I don't want to do the math, and I don't want to know how big that number is. I'm joking. It was a long time ago, and I've learned a lot since. But when I first started working in professional settings where public policy questions were being explored, it was initially very surprising to me how much of the way politics is done is rooted in like a way of thinking. I wouldn't have had this language to describe it then, but I do now. How much of the way that decision-making happens, at least in the place that I live, in Nova Scotia, is rooted in a way of thinking that I don't agree with, that I don't empathize with, or I didn't empathize with or understand at the time. Nor was it really publicly discussed. It wasn't the stated reason for the way things were. And I think the same frustration was something that was appearing in a lot of these conversations that I would have later in life, which is like, the people I'm speaking with, the people I'm trying to connect with through this channel, are people that deeply wants to understand not just how things can be done better, how things can be improved, but how we can make like a coherent working whole. And if maybe we'll stick with the example of government. But like people are really concerned about like, it irks many of us when we see conflicting priorities happening within the same government or within the same department. It's a red flag that something isn't being managed well. And I think anybody who's new to, I guess, professional life, as I was in my early 20s, you're kind of playing this game where I happened to be in a position, I was executive director of a student organization. So I happened to be lucky enough to be in a position where I got to be in a lot of rooms where everybody in the room had at least a decade, usually more experience than me being in rooms like that. And that was a steep learning curve. And at the time, I wasn't able to necessarily realize how much of what it was that I was finding, I guess, an opportunity to disagree with was that, like, me as a 20-something hadn't acclimatized to the realities of professional life in this place, and how much of that was like a healthy resistance, like a healthy, like that might be how you do it, but it's not going to be how I do it. In terms of like the rationale that was used for making decisions. I realize it might be helpful to give an example of what I'm talking about, but I will just elaborate a bit on the context. So I was in these settings and the people around the table knew it's like I'm, 21 or 22 years old, and maybe there's a few of us at the time, student leaders, and everybody else in the room has more experience. So there's like some leniency for the way we might say things, and also like a healthy sort of nurturing also happening in those contexts where it's like, well, we're going to help you. Like we might not be on the same side since we were an advocacy organization, but there was a sincere desire to help from the adults to the much younger adults in the room, help us figure out how we could perform better in the roles that we were there for. Encouragement, a fair amount of constructive criticism. And again, I was weighing that as a young advocate, thinking that is something I need to work with my ego around that in order to navigate the situation in such a way that like both I can see where my blind spots might be and correct for them if what I'm hearing about is genuine, real, and something I want to work on. And they can see that I'm doing that so they don't feel shut down. But also I have priorities and I have a job and I have people that I report to that have expectations about how I would perform in this role in this meeting. So I worked in that role for a while and slowly, I guess, learned the ropes and felt quite comfortable with that position. I did that job for about 3 years. And then within a year after leaving that job, I started at another organization called Springtide, which I've talked a bit about on this channel before. And the mission behind that organization was kind of like to reinvent how government worked, to reinvent how democracy worked, or I tried to use this language, but it was not palatable to many people. But if I'm kind of direct, and I suspect I can be more direct in this context because you're the people I'm trying to speak to, this language will resonate with the people I'm trying to speak to. Let me say that. But the real mission, if I had figured out a way to be direct and honest about what we were about. It was to evolve democracy, to think of democracy as like a living process that the human species uses, akin to other human processes that we use at the individual level, but sort of scaled up. So it's this process of like bringing information in to the leadership of a place and the governing institutions and the public institutions of a place, and having a good process for ensuring that whatever information, be it votes or survey results or focus groups, is translated in through a value system that prioritizes and triages different kinds of information and makes sense of the complexity that exists in a population to generate the kind of public services that would be best for that population, depending on, obviously changing circumstances that governments and populations of people can find themselves in. But the mission, if I were to, kind of succinctify it, would be to be a force that advocates for the healthy evolution of democratic systems, structures, and cultures. We could workshop that for a while, but I suspect what I'm saying resonates with the people that I'm trying to reach, I hope. Let me know. And it was in that role that I really started to appreciate that there are very different value systems in not just the context that I was working in, but in kind of any context. And at some point on this journey, I kind of gave up trying to persuade people. Because the topic we're on today is, how do you deal with loneliness in the context of you're the only person who thinks a certain way and you're lonely in thought and you don't identify with the conventional thought patterns in the place that you work or in a context that you exist in. I'm going to adjust the setting here so I don't get feedback. And so it was during that time that I started to realize a conversation that I played a big part in was a conversation around electoral reform. And I was running that organization during the time that Justin Trudeau came to power in Canada as Prime Minister in 2015 and had promised to reform the Canadian voting system to make it more fair. I think his promise was, we'll make sure every vote counts, which is a whole topic on its own in terms of what did he mean when he said that, and where was he coming from in terms of value system when he made that commitment. So I had a lot of conversations about electoral reform we had probably a dozen public conversations about electoral reform, and many more private conversations. Public conversations meaning conversations where we invited people into the room, got them tea and snacks, ran through a presentation on the different systems we could use to elect our leaders, and then had a dialogue about it, and then had voting on it. And what I learned on reflection from those conversations was that people approach pretty much every issue from a set of lenses that works for them, a set of values that works for them. And I think it was so unobvious to me that this is what was happening at first, was that I had this presumption that there are just a lot of people out there operating without a value system. And I realized that now that's a mistake made by virtue of the fact that I couldn't recognize their value system. I couldn't place their value system. I knew what my value system was, but I hadn't figured out. I was very curious about it. How could other people have different value systems? But I couldn't articulate it. And it wasn't until I found the work of Ken Wilber that I came to realize, and it wasn't, I'll talk about the work and then I'll share my journey with it. But yes, I found Ken Wilber's work. I think Integral Theory was the first book that I came across from him. And Integral Theory is starting with the assumption that like everything does fit together in this universe. And while we can be frustrated at the fact that we might not understand it, if you start with the presumption that everything does fit together and reality does work, it functions, and then work backwards from there, then that's a pretty good starting place, because a lot of people are so frustrated with the way things are that they get hyper-focused on changing them without necessarily first understanding the way the world is. And just like I was in my early 20s, I think people are rightly suspicious when someone tries to explain, well, this is the way the world works. Because if I'm over here explaining to you how the world works, and in your mind, you're just thinking, let's say we're in an argument about something. In your mind, you're just thinking, well, of course he would say that because it stands to benefit him that reality works that way. If I'm appearing to you as sort of like resisting the argument you're making. So I think when I was first trying to wrap my head around, well, how does the politics of this place work in that advocate context that I was working in, I knew I didn't know enough to know when I was being led and when I was being tutored. I didn't know the difference between those two things, and it took me some time to figure it out and learn how to read body language and edge behavior and all kinds of other things that, now I think I am much more inoculated to that. So back to Ken Wilber, back to integral theory. Integral theory starts with that assumption that everything does fit together. And when it comes to things like political disagreements or just any kind of disagreement or conflict within like a group or two people that are disagreeing, part of the approach that Wilber and some of the writers and researchers that he draws on in that book, Integral Theory, part of his approach is to say, what can explain for the differences of opinions in groups where people disagree? I think when we're the ones in conflict, it's very easy just to get caught up in the project of winning the conflict and the task of winning the conflict. If I want the basement walls to be painted a light blue and my partner wants basement walls to be painted light yellow, it's like, we're probably not going to be satisfied just by mixing those colors together and painting the walls, right? Like, I'm advocating for light blue. I'll be happy when I get light blue on the walls and we win, or my side wins. So integral theory would say, it's like, what are some tools? Like, what are some mental models we can put out there as a means of understanding how it is that the two people in this relationship want to paint the basement walls different colors? And I can't continue that example. So I'm going to go back to Wilber and talk about what he explores in the book, and the methodology that he explores in the book is he draws on spiral dynamics, which is a way of understanding how human beings, human individuals, and groups and cultures continue to evolve and continue to develop, I guess is probably a better word. Evolve's not as good a word here as is develop, but continue to develop throughout the course of our adult lifetimes, and how, as a species, it is that we are developing, or I guess we can use evolving in that context. And what Wilber says, and what the spiral dynamics theorists say is that there are 8 stages, or I guess 8 stages that we know a fair amount about, that human beings move through based on our life conditions. So if you can imagine the very earliest of human civilizations, not civilizations, but if you can imagine the very earliest of humans, where we didn't necessarily have many tools, we didn't have much in terms of a language system, we didn't have much in terms of, we didn't inherit much from our ancestors in the earliest human communities. So this is just like, cavemen era. The color code for this stage is called beige. I like to think of it as like, it's beige, the dirt is beige, and we can imagine, the priorities of individuals and groups, if there are any at beige, is simply to have food and shelter and the ability to reproduce. It's very basic. And when you see people who don't have food and shelter today, if you meet them on the street, or you interact with them, or if you work with them, then you can see how the beige mindset works. Like it's really worth, I would suggest, having a conversation with somebody who does not have guarantees for food and shelter, and just get a sense of their logic system. How are they thinking? They're not thinking the same. They're just not thinking the same kind of clarity that people beyond beige are at. And I think that's very obvious. And a mistake that often gets made is, well, if that's how they're thinking, no wonder they're on the street. If that's how they approach life, like, no wonder they're a homeless person. When in reality, if any of us were homeless tomorrow and without the whatever family structure or social structure, the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to start thinking like beige, right? Impulse control, gone. Your ability to plan more than a day ahead is gone. And this is not necessarily just true for people who are in that challenging of a context, but it could be sort of like, you may know because of where you're at right now that your conditions aren't safe, whether it's your home life or your workplace, and you may know based on your finances or the mix of conditions in your life that you're like one step away from beige, that like a couple mistakes or unfortunate circumstances and you're in beige. So your logic will start to work like beige logic. Above beige is purple. And purple is where there's sort of like magical, mystical tribalism. And at purple is where we start to think of like, oh, there's a cause and an effect to things. There is and it's not accurate necessarily, or I guess I should say it's not accurate to our modern sensibilities, but one of the cautions that the authors of the spiral dynamics theory give is that it's possible, I don't know why I adjusted the camera, it's possible that there are things we ought to go back to these stages to retrieve, because we did get out of beige and we did move beyond purple. Most of the world has moved beyond purple. Some people are still living in purple. That there might have been some ways of knowing that we lost in migrating up the spiral. You can think of it as evolution thinks of it as like, we got to develop the most basic needs to take care of ourselves first. So if the first thing that was developed in beige is like, feed yourself, keep yourself safe, and, find that basic sense of security and like reproduce if you can. It matters more from an evolutionary perspective to figure that stuff out than to figure out impulse control. That can develop later on. So when you start to get into purple, you start to get a sense of logic. We start to use our big frontal cortexes, and we start to see the human mind drawing connections between things that maybe people who are later on in the spiral wouldn't make those connections between anymore. But at this stage in the spiral, where you might see logic like Don Beck gives the example, like the cow died when the moon was full. The cow died because the moon was full. Because it happened twice in this village that became the story of cause and effect. And maybe there is some truth to that. And maybe it was valuable to have that understanding at that stage of development. So cause and effect comes online. People realize that they're more powerful in groups. So we start to get group traditions and norms come online at stage purple. So a lot of what exists at purple is very communal. And this is one of the things that alternates between the beige stage and the purple stage. Is beige was concerned about the individual and purple was concerned about the group. And the pattern that gets reflected throughout the spiral is each stage oscillates. So you go from purple into red, which is a very competitive and individualistic stage. So when you graduate from purple and move into red, and I should say graduate is probably a misleading term. It's not a perfect transition, but it's easy when you look at the research on developmental psychology across many, many different researchers. This is the trajectory that happens. It's not like, oh, suddenly you're green. Green is much later on the spiral, or suddenly you're red. It's, slowly and over time, someone moves out of the red aspect or the purple aspect of the developmental spiral. They, start to think thoughts like, I can do all of this better, me all on my own, because, there's some sense of ego really starts to develop beyond purple. There isn't much ego, it seems, at the beige and purple stages. At beige, there's no shame. These people are just trying to survive. Maybe that is not necessarily true for people who have been beyond beige and then go back to beige temporarily, by suddenly becoming homeless or suddenly finding themselves in beige circumstances. I know when I've felt the threat of beige in my life, there is shame for sure. But for someone who's never been beyond beige, there wouldn't be shame. There wouldn't be that sense of ego. And at purple, it's a very communal identity. And even some of the, I guess, most cultures that were discovered, but cultures that were contacted in the last century that had not had contact with modern technologies or modern civilization. There were a few I've heard of that researchers visited, anthropologists visited, where there was no word for I in some of these cultures that had never moved much beyond purple. Not only was there no word for I, it wasn't a concept that had meaning in those places, but there was a word for the collective. There was words like we. And another thing that happens in that context is compersion, which is essentially when you feel what another person feels. So compassion is like, if you're going through a divorce, well, I can be compassionate towards you in a way that only somebody who has gone through a divorce can be towards you. I can't know exactly what it is you're going through, but I could talk with you and walk with you while it's happening. Compersion is not that. Compersion is like, if you sit and talk to me about the pain you're experiencing, it like I'm right there in it with you. So beyond purple, so we go beige, purple, red. Beyond purple, you get to red. And when you get to red, you are in a very competitive, ego-driven state. And I'll have to look at the percentages. It's certainly something that Ken Wilber describes, but a lot of the world is in red. And a lot of the people that are in power in the world are in red. Donald Trump is red. That sort of like, when people think, how does someone like Donald Trump, which like I very much thought in 2016 when he first came to power, this thought of like, well, how does somebody in that position, like so blatantly self-interested, so like obviously out of touch with, like disconnected from any ability to sense how antisocial his behaviors are, like how is that a winning political strategy? And the answer is that like, because there's that much red in the world, that's as far as many people have developed. So these are, I think it's important to recognize too, though, that like you can't skip red. Like red is a developmental stage. So Donald Trump, a lot of the people that voted for him, like are right where they ought to be. Like it would be strange understanding what we understand about the developmental spiral for them to just suddenly not be in red. And I think what would be, an ideal set of circumstances is that all those people have forces within their life that are like in a healthy context. What would happen is, I'm just trying to think of when would I have been in red and what got me out of it. I don't know. Like, I think your parenting plays a role in this. I'm guessing there's shades of all of these things that come through. So like maybe when I first started doing entrepreneurial work, I was probably red activated. Red was driving a lot of what I was doing, and I had to learn to integrate that. But the consequences of acting out of red in like a community setting or in a workplace setting is like, well, you make enemies, you develop some sort of like bad karma in that context, and that bad karma then like it feeds back to you. Like you will eventually have to start cleaning up the messes that you made, and realize that it's not just all about satisfying your own self-interest, and not just that, but that there's like strength and power in numbers, and the teams are stronger than me's. And if you can master that, then you'll be able to do some of the things that the people who are, you're looking up at the next layer, which is blue, and being like, oh yeah, I can see how this individual who has mastered some of the developmental markers of blue, it would be good for me to become more like that person. But I think a sad consequence of the world we live in, the way systems are structured, is that if like red is highly strategic, and if you look at the way Trump communicates, you can be red and very ineffective, and you'll probably get to blue more quickly than someone like Donald Trump. But if you're as strategic and you understand something about how change works, which I think Trump very much does, you can continue. I'm trying to think of the right word for it, but it just if you were a really good con artist, you could get away with, or if you're a really good strategic, I'm trying not to give advice here, but I don't fear anybody is watching this video that's going to take what I'm about to say and consider it advice or counsel. But say you wanted to destroy a lot of things. If you were strategic and smart in red, people in red can be very smart. They can be deceptive. They can look like they're not as smart as they are. So if you wanted to cause damage from a place of red, this ego-driven, competitive, advantage-seeking mindset, you could do a lot of damage if you were good at covering your tracks. But for most people, that's too much to hold. So they move into blue. And when they move into blue, blue is really where it's sort of that's where strength in numbers comes out. That's where, there's, I think, a real sense of, I think brotherhood. I think blue, I think community. I think blue, I think, people that can build churches and mosques and temples and get the people in their community participating in something. I think there is often, blue is not a religion, and blue is not meant to, I don't think it requires a religion. There's probably an atheistic version of blue, but I think it's best symbolized through we build a church and it's taking care of the community. I think blue is often well symbolized by, if you're in Nova Scotia, if you're in Halifax, Mike Savage is a blue mayor. When he ran for office, he had everybody from all the different parties on his campaign team, even though he had been a liberal. And the message he was preaching was it was very blue. It's sometimes we need to do hard things, but we'll do them together. And that's, I think, kind of the essence of it, is that we're not going to reward selfishness. We're going to look out for people who look out for their community. We're going to encourage people to develop into good citizens. And I mean, when I'm around blue, I guess just to give you the context, so maybe you can draw comparisons in your own world, it's just sort of I know I disagree with the strongest blue leaders. If we're going to talk about public policy, or if we're going to talk about systems thinking, blue is neither going to get what it is that I'm trying to describe, nor are they going to be my most vehement opponents. Or vehement's a stronger word than I think I meant to use, but they're, we're gonna have a good conversation. They're not gonna get me. They're gonna probably empathize or try to understand what I'm saying. And at the end of the day, they're going to be very practical and ask questions well, let me know how I can help, or call me if you ever need somebody to talk to, or they have good boundaries. Typically, my experience with people who are in blue, I think a lot of men end up staying in blue because it's kind of safe. or it's a safe place for them to be for the people that they might be fearful of offending. It's a good fallback place. I think if you speak from a place of blue, you can draw. This is, I think, true of all the layers of the spiral. But if you can really hold, like if you're a well integrated blue, and what I mean when I say well integrated is really, it's like you haven't just rejected all the earlier layers of the spiral. You've integrated the positive aspects and you've sort of illuminated the shadow aspects of the earlier stages of the spiral. So there's a great degree of self-awareness. You don't lose the ability to be competitive. If we throw you into life circumstances that bring out your red or purple, then that's exactly what's going to happen. If you ever put a bunch of people in a new context and make them problem solve, you'll see a lot of purple, right? You'll see a lot of cause and effect reasoning that is effectively magical for anybody who knows how it actually works, who is familiar with that context. But the power at any level of the spiral is that like you can draw people up. It's like if I show you what really good, solid, integrated blue looks like, and you're at red, and maybe you're feeling kind of like lonely at red, and red has started to not quite work out from you. It's like you'll hear what I'm saying and like start to move in the direction of blue. It's not going to feel good to stay in one place. It's going to feel good to move forward. So after blue, we go back to an individual focused. People leaving blue start to have a sense of maybe this community thing isn't all it's cracked up to be. There are things that I can only pursue if I pursue them on my own, or maybe I don't trust the information that's getting circulated in this group, and because there is such a degree of religion anchoring blue, religion often organized religion is sort of like it thrives at blue. And anybody who's followed organized religions knows the kinds of problems that exist within organized religion. And so people will often just reject all of it and move into orange, where orange is kind of like, you're really your own person. And I think people tend to maintain a lot of the values that they learned in blue, but it's sort of like, I don't need a God to tell me how to be a good person, or I don't need, I don't need that level of, like I remember when I was a high school kid and I was starting to learn about kind of the dark side of organized religion, because I had been relatively on board with organized religion up until that point. And I started to, like, my thought process was like, I can figure this out on my own. I don't need that kind of guidance. And so there's a natural movement away from not just organized religion, but like authority in general. Hey-o, this is going to be a super abrupt ending to what is already a lengthy video. If you're enjoying where this is going, I will continue it in another video, but I have lost track of time again, and I can't keep doing it right now. But I will make it so that the next video is a continuation of this, and a continuation of this exploration where we unpack the developmental spiral. And once we do that, we can return to the question of why is it so easy to feel alone in the way you're thinking? Why are so many of us in this context where we don't find ourselves with people who think like we do? And what can we do about it?